Okay, it's 8 o'clock. Thanks for everyone for waking up so early, especially if you're on the West Coast, to come to this presentation of Intro to the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War, uh, hosted by Patrick Pence. Patrick lives in Tallahassee, Florida. He's been playing GCACW for about 13 years. He's been um, a former tourney champion with the BPA Rising from the Ranks Award. He's a quarterfinalist in another tournament. And more importantly, he was a contestant on Jeopardy in 2009. Is that online? Can we all watch that, Patrick?
It is not. I do have a link to a personal copy, but if you
Okay.
blinked, you missed it. They reran it on the 28th of last month after 11 years because it was part of the Alex Trebek farewell tribute, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that. So some people saw it online, and I got phone calls and texts saying, "I see you on TV." So
I have a good friend up here that was just on it, and he did pretty well. I think he won 3 games. So, but anyway, more importantly, as far as the great campaigns of the American Civil War, Patrick's been involved in play testing a number of the games, proofing a lot of the rules, etc. And most importantly, he has been our faithful video producer. He produces a line of how-to videos. So if you want to know more about how to play great campaigns, you can watch his how-to videos on YouTube. And he also records a lot of our sessions, replay sessions, so you can watch those, watch other people play. And he's recording most of the sessions for this convention. So I appreciate all that he does for me or us. And like I say, he's from Tallahassee, Florida, where he is a GIS coordinator for public safety for the city of Tallahassee. Is that correct?
that is correct.
Okay, good. We're going to turn it over to Patrick in just a second, but I just want to mention that after this session, Clyde Longest, who's also on the call here right now, and I are going to be hosting an introductory multiplayer game. And you'll be able to meet us in the, where is it here? The intro multiplayer game room, which is just below this session, this channel. And we're going to be playing a game of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it's specifically designed for new players. We are going to be the overall commanders, going to be assigning a corps or two to each of the sub commanders, and we'll be helping you as much as you would like with learning the game and actually making moves and seeing how the game is played. So hopefully, after you watch this, you'll join us there. And without further ado, oh, and also one other thing, if you also would like to play, instead of going to the introductory multiplayer game, if you'd like to play a one-on-one short scenario, the short scenario round 2 is going to be starting at 10 o'clock. And you basically, if you'd like to sign up for that, we can get you to play either with a more experienced player who will help you learn the game, or pair you up against another new or beginner player so you have a good match against that player. So that's your opportunities immediately following this. But without further ado, I will turn it over to Patrick to let him introduce the great campaigns of the American Civil War to everyone.
And thank you very much for that introduction, Ken. It is a pleasure to
Mhm.
be here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your Great Campaigns 101 course. Just like in high school and college, all the 101 courses were at god awful 8 a.m., so this is no exception. Um, I'm very excited to teach this. I do this at least at one event every year for the last 7 or 8 years at Board Game Geek Con. We would have sort of an impromptu Great Campaigns morning, I think on the first day after registration, and I would run sort of a tutelage class for the first hour to get the newbies playing, and then we would just jump right in and have several games running all at once, much to the chagrin of some of the other Euro gamers looking for table space in the room. But it has been fantastic success and growing each and every year. I think I'm working off of a list here, and for those of you who are brand spanking new to this, as Ken mentioned, what I've been doing over the last several years is well, 8 years ago, I got a wild hair and I decided to do sort of a video instruction over five parts, and put that on YouTube, and got some great feedback over the years about it, and just sort of let it lie dormant. And like most people, this year of quarantine has provided some opportunities as far as creative abilities. So with Ken starting things up last March with building sort of a group player audience online, I thought it was a time to dust off the old YouTube recorder and started going through again. And the goal was to start doing some additional instruction information. And what I ended up doing, and he's here in the room, Roger Kittleson, who is my partner in crime, he asked for some basic instruction, and I used that as sort of the benchmark, the starting point for him. We started with Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 with Cedar Mountain, and decided to just start playing through scenarios and recording them for everyone's benefit. So as Ken mentioned, I've got a YouTube channel. It's called Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials, and we have just been going through all the modules so far. We've gone through Stonewall Jackson's Way 2, we've been through Stonewall in the Valley, and we are almost done. I guess we've got about 3 scenarios left in on to Richmond, and I want to give a shout out to Joe Balkowski, because we use this as an opportunity to show off the upcoming new reprint materials with the new maps, and it has been more successful than we could have wildly expected, in the fact that the audience feedback is tremendous. Everyone is building enthusiasm for the future reprint of On to Richmond, along with Grant Takes Command in the Overland campaign. So we are just pleased as punch that it's going so well, and in and of itself, it's helping build the audience. So what I want to do here today is, for those of you who are absolutely brand spanking new, I'm going to say this is a 1-hour attempt, maybe 90 minutes, attempt to cover what I cover in about 4 hours in much more detail in those videos. So if you want the richer part of this for instruction, definitely go and check those out at some point in the future, because I do get into the weeds on a lot of things. Today I'm going to give it sort of the 10,000 foot view. I'm going to try to cover a lot off of this list, and I think of the major activities we're going to just talk about. We're going to talk about the game as a whole. We're going to talk about terrain, the map features, the unit features, and then we're going to talk about the basic actions of moving and attacking in those variations. So we're going to get you out of here today with just enough information to be dangerous, and as Ken said, you will be ready to jump into a multiplayer game with some instructional help, and more than anything, at least you will get your toes wet. And I'm presuming that based on what was shown in the instruction last night, you are on Discord, so that's a plus. You're in this room listening to this. You're on Vassal, because I see many people are sharing the room. And if you're not on Vassal, you're at least watching this live stream. So we've got all of those covered. So I can check that box off of my list here. What I think is probably a good idea to start with, I'm looking at the Roads to Gettysburg 308 module for Vassal, and I'm going to use that as the platform today for all my instruction. And I think it's always a good thing whenever I show something on Vassal is I just go through some of the salient points of the Vassal interface if you're not familiar with it. And we saw last night there are a lot of people who are brand spanking new to Vassal. I think just for the purposes of this context today, I'm just going to show you what some of the things I'm doing as we go through this. Some of the pieces look a little different because of some of the capabilities have sort of been packaged all together here in some of these units by Alberto Romero, who is one of our, he's over on the Spanish channel right now, but he is our Vassal craftsman extraordinaire. And I think over the last few years, a lot of people said, there's just so many chits on the map normally. How do we condense a lot of this information into a streamlined, usable interface? So I think that's what you're seeing here today. So I'm going to explain some of the unit information here first, and then we'll talk about the map, and then we will actually get right into the action cycle itself. If you have any questions, I see most everybody is muted. You can certainly type them. If you're on Vassal, you can type them. Just proceed it with question, and then what your question is in the text box. And if I see it up there, I will answer it live. Or you can unmute yourself and interrupt, and we'll go from there. But if there's nothing to get us underway, if there's nothing before we get underway, then I will start us off with talking about the Vassal interface. So as you see here, whenever you're using Great Campaigns online with Vassal, as Zeke pointed out last night, each one of these are module based, and they all have essentially the same framework. The toolbar is more or less consistent in the newer modules. That's everything from Stonewall Jackson's Way 2 from 2013 forward. Most of them have been designed with a consistent toolbar from Rob Doan's first setup of it, his redesign forward. Now I think they're all adopting most of the same button layouts and tool sets. I will say that most everything has right-click functionality, so when you click on a unit, you can right-click it with your mouse, and it gives you a whole host of other options as far as the things that you want to do. You can add fatigue and demoralized markers and things like that. These also have corresponding keystrokes, which when you get to be more familiar with it and you want to save time with all the mouse clicks, you can come up and do Control Q or Control W to add and subtract fatigues. The other great selling point of the Vassal module is that there is automation built into a lot of these things, specifically in the recover button. That can be the most odious task for anybody playing this on the table, because you've got to sit there and subtract fatigue markers and flip things and all that. The Vassal module has that automation and intelligence built on you, provided the game state is correct. At the end of the turn, you can either recover in a sunny day or rain turn, and it will throw breastworks on, it will flip things to exhausted, it will do all of the housekeeping tasks at the end of the turn for you. So if you've not played one of these yet with a Vassal module, this is of course a great selling point for that. Let's look at, I guess the best starting point for any of this is I'm going to bring this stack of Lee and Longstreet and everybody, and I'm going to presumptuously bring it over into Gettysburg here. And I'm going to pull out the individual pieces and parts, and we're going to talk about some of the different units that you see here in Great Campaigns, because that is the heart and soul of it are the units, and understanding what the different notations on the units mean and what they are is critically important to understanding what you're doing with them. So we'll start here with we have two essential types of units. We have the infantry and we have cavalry, and within each of those you have leadership, and you actually have the infantry unit or the cavalry unit. And we also have down here, probably on the Union side, we have some artillery units. I will bring up, here's Artillery Reserve 1. I will bring one of those up there for you. And you can see this is essentially the majority of the dynamic units, the moving units in the game. We will talk about leadership here first. It comes in a couple of different flavors. We have the Army leader here, which is Robert E. Lee, and it gives a notation of obviously his color indicates Confederate or Union, his notation of which army he controls. In different games that will be different things. And we have Corps commanders. We have Longstreet here, who is the leader of the 1st Corps, and the numbers represent, on the Army leader, for example, that is his overall Army command rating. And that will come into play when you're either doing a grand assault attempt during an attack, or if in some cases you can activate many units in an Army activation, which we will probably not touch on today because that is specific to certain game modules, but that's essentially what that number represents. The Corps commanders are the much more active use. What they will allow you to do is you can do what's known as a leader activation. And again, when we get into the action cycle and we talk about the individual pieces and parts, these Corps commanders let you activate multiple units either for consecutive marches, or you can use their command ability to launch an assault on an adjacent hex. So when we get into combat, we will see how that works. The two numbers here represent one, the number 4 there for Longstreet is his overall tactical capability, which is used in a measurement when you're setting up an attack, and the 7 represents his ability, his command ability, as far as when he's launching an attack. and you will make a check against that number to see if the units that you are selecting for an assault actually have the capability to make the assault. Over here on the artillery reserve, we can see that it has a few numbers, and we will talk about the difference between the infantry. Well, I guess I'll start with the infantry here first. We have McLaws. There are indications of which corps he belongs to. That's the letter I on the left, and he is a division. So that's the double X reference there. A lot of that is just for nomenclature. Doesn't necessarily impact the game, but just for you to be aware of how large or how small these unit sizes are. You can see this is a division. The first number there, this is one of the Vassal specific conflations that we see. Normally this would be represented by a separate manpower counter, and in this case it's 15. So each manpower value represents about 500 men. So this represents a division of 7,500 men for this McLaws division. The second number there is his commander ability, his tactical capability, and you will use that in lieu of the overall corps commander. If he just happens to be by himself and making an attack, you would use that tactical capability when making an attack. And the 6 represents the number of artillery batteries that this unit carries with it into battle. So that will vary anywhere from 0 in some cases all the way up to 6 or 7. We can see some very large artillery battery numbers on some units. We have the artillery reserve 1 unit here, which is a separate small brigade that is carried along with, and it can be activated by different leaders, and it will represent not only a small cadre of manpower. You can see it has 2 manpower here. It has an inherent tactical capability of 2, but more importantly, it carries an additional 6 pieces of artillery, or 6 batteries of artillery, that when stacked with other units, if they're making an assault, those can all be added into a larger attack. Artillery reserves are usually restricted. They can't carry leaders with them. You'll notice that when I first pulled this over, and you can see this up here with Buford, Buford is a leader who is stacked with a subordinate unit. So leaders always have to be stuck with either, or with an infantry unit. They can never be with an artillery or a cavalry unit. So you will often see an army leader with you will see Lee with Longstreet here, and they will always be with some kind of an infantry unit moving along. And one of the other benefits of Vassal is when you hover over something, it will show you the entire stack if you're not used to it. I see a lot of new Vassal users kind of moving pieces out so they can see what's underneath there. You can save yourself a lot of work and heartache by just floating over it, hovering over it for a second, and it will show you what's in the stack. So that is your essential unit breakdown. The cavalry works the same way. We can see up here they have the cavalry notation in the NATO symbology. Buford is a leader of the 1st Cavalry Brigade, and he's the division leader rather with the brigade, and he's got Gamble there as part of it, and they each have their own individual. You can see the cavalry leadership is not even any better than his subordinates. So you've got infantry and you've got cavalry. Those are your basic unit pieces. The fatigue markers. Now in this game, I'm going to pull some out here if we actually have them. In the all-in-ones, these are represented in, and it looks like they're not in here. They're not, so that's okay. I will show you McLaws here as an example. During the game, during the action cycle, when we go through things, as they perform activities, they will gain fatigue. So when there is no marker on them at all, if you were looking at this on the table and you had no fatigue marker underneath it, that's considered fatigue level 0. As they start expending actions, so this is green on Vassal, represents fatigue level 1, fatigue level 2 is yellow, 3 is orange, and then when they get to fatigue level 4, they are done for the turn, which is each turn is 1 day here. So when they get to fatigue level 4, they are done and really cannot do anything except defend in battle. There are some optional roles that let you do some other things, but that's for another time. So McClaws here is at fatigue level 4. He has expended all of his capability for actions through the day. Now this can happen in a couple of different ways. They can either potentially do 4 different actions, and each time they do an action they gain a fatigue, or the results of combat can cause them to accumulate fatigue very quickly. So management of fatigue is the heart and soul of this game, is knowing how to best use your resources while you've got them before they become totally and completely fatigued for the day. Once and we will talk here briefly about the cycle of the game, how a turn works, but essentially players keep playing until they have no units left to move, or until they both agree to pass on a turn, and then they will move on to the recovery phase. All right, so let's talk about the overall flow of the game. Typically, a scenario will have specific setup information. What we're looking at here is the Battle of Gettysburg, which is scenario 5 from Roads to Gettysburg 2. And they will have all the units preset in their locations, and then you will go through a simple turn, which is starting with any random events. You will do a leader transfer phase, which we'll talk about in detail in a little bit. Then you will have the action cycle, and actions are determined by initiative, and we'll talk about how the initiative cycle works, or the segment works. And then you will just constantly go back indefinitely back and forth, performing these actions one after another, rolling for initiative each time until, again, both units have used up all of their resources on their side, or they have optionally decided to mutually pass, and in which case the day is done and we will move on to the next turn. Before we get into all that, let's talk briefly about the map here. The map is the fundamental part of understanding how this works. Joe, I was rereading your introduction to Stonewall Jackson's Way last night, and Joe has jumped out, but that's okay. I was rereading his intro, and he was talking about the germ of this game. The series was sort of a walk in the woods, and understanding how much terrain affected 19th century army movement, and that is certainly on display here with great campaigns. The map itself represents a vast road network in southern Pennsylvania here. Each one of the maps, the Charlie Kibler maps, are gorgeous on their own, but as part of the game itself, they are superb as far as reflecting how you are using your resources, bringing your resources to bear against the enemy. The road network here is the one thing I want to have most people focus on. We see heavy lines here which represent pikes. We have red lines which represent railroad lines, and we have the smaller individual thinner lines which represents sort of the local roads of varying degrees and qualities. In some cases here in the mountains, you may even have, let's see if I can find any, I don't see any in South Mountain, looks like most of them are pretty well. You will have dashed lines which represent trails, which for the most part, all things being equal, whenever you're moving units around, 99% of the time you're going to be using the road network, and that is going to be the most efficient way to move these units around. However, there are times when you want to go off-road, when you're setting up flanks, things like that. Tactically, there are reasons that you may want to go off-road, and you will use the local terrain as a determiner of how these units can move. Looking at the terrain itself, all of this clear tan area is representative of open. It's called open terrain. It is sort of the most affordable for moving. We have the light green here, which is rolling. We have the light green with speckled here, which is rough. Since 2013, since the reprinting of Stonewall Jackson's Way 2, they decided to add a new terrain type. We can see here 2731, and then some over here to the east. These are hills, so they're not quite mountains, and they're not quite rolling or rough. They're that in between, and that gives another tactical consideration for using that particular terrain type. Then we have mountains here. Mountains, for the most part, are impassable unless they are crossed by a road. And you can see you can move through this mountain pass here at Lath Mill, but otherwise you cannot cross over hecksides that are mountain. We have forests here. We have woods, and those play an important part in movement because they actually have a concept known as a restricted zone of control. So when we'll get into restricted zone of control, that basically allows units to move past other units when they are in the woods. So that will also factor in when making attacks and setting up flanks. We also have water features that represent the light blue here. Very simple, are creeks. Most of them are named as such. We have the heavier blue lines are minor rivers, and then when you move all the way down into, for example, it's not on this map, but the Potomac would have a much thicker. Let's see if it's up here. Yes, the Susquehanna up here is a major river. You can see it's got the black border around it. So each of those three water feature types will affect how movement across them occurs, and whether or not movement can occur across those features, and when you're making attacks across them. Okay, so we've talked about the map, we've talked about the units. It's time to actually talk about how to put all these things into play. And that being said, we need to talk about the action cycle. So we mentioned in a turn, you go through. I'm going to open up here let's see, in my tables here. That is something that every single one of the modules will provide, is some of the basic tables. You'll have your combat chart here, the terrain effects, as I mentioned. You can look at the individual type of major and minor terrain, how the road network works, and the hecksides and how those affect movement and combat. Just a little reminder chart for how movement works. When we get into movement, you'll see that there's an inherent advantage to the Confederacy just because of their knowledge of the local terrain and their ability to move these units around. There's command radius, and we will get into retreats. We'll probably not talk on retreats too much today. Some of the heavier things that there are going to be seminars on later, I don't want to delve too deeply in. I just want to make you familiar with today. So the concepts of cavalry usage, that's going to be at noon today. That's Jeb's ride, and you can learn more about how cavalry is used effectively in this game. And then later on this afternoon, they will talk specifically about how to effectively use forces in flanking, which again I will talk a little bit about in combat today, but we will address they will address more in depth in their seminar. All right, so game turn works like I said. You would go through, you would set up, you determine any random events if that scenario would require it, and then the first thing each side will do is they have the opportunity to transfer leaders. And leader transfer works something like this. If I had, say, Hill up here at Pender, and I decided at the beginning of the day that it would be more advantageous to have him with another subordinate unit, as long as that unit is within 10 hexes, terrain is not a factor, but other units, enemy units, and their zone of control is a factor. I could very simply say I am moving Hill over to Heath, and that's what I would do, and I would go through any and all leaders that I'd like to move. Now in every game turn, the Union does all of their leader transfers first, and then that gives the Confederate side the opportunity to react in kind. So Union does all of theirs first, and then the Confederacy moves theirs. Then once everyone has moved any and all leaders that they wish, then you move on to the action cycle. And the action cycle is initiative based, and most of you, I think, if you've looked at this at all, you understand how that works. This is a D6 system, and both sides will very simply roll a die. And in most of the modules, with the exception of Battle Above the Clouds and Atlanta is Ours, those are kind of the two exceptions right now because they are Western theater. But for the most part, all of the game systems, all the game titles in the Eastern, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania that we see here, in any of those situations, both sides roll a die, and on ties, the Confederacy will win the tiebreak. So that's very easy to remember. So anything double, the Confederate is going to win. So that gives them a slight advantage statistically over the likelihood of getting the initiative. Once the player wins the initiative, then they can perform one action. We're going to talk about the 5 individual actions here. 3 of them are what we're going to focus on today, and there are 2 additional ones that you will use as part of your toolkit. But the 3 that I'm going to highlight today are you can activate a single unit to move, which means marching them around. You can activate a leader who will then subsequently activate as many units within his radius, which is 3 hexes, that he wishes to perform a march action. And then they will go consecutively. Those units will march one at a time, performing all of their actions as they go along. When one is done, the next one moves, and so on and so on. I think one of the new player gotchas that we see for this is somebody activates a leader, and he's stacked with 3 units, and they all just kind of pick up the stack and move along. That is verboten in this game. That is not correct. So we will hopefully teach you that we will teach that bad habit out of you if you've already started doing it, because that's not the way it works here. And then the third action is a leader who is stacked with 1 or more units could activate 1 or more of them for an attempted assault on a unit that is next door. So, for example, I'm going to put McClaws up here. Longstreet is with him. Longstreet could activate McClaws, bring him to fatigue level 1. So there, and he makes a declaration that he's going to attempt to assault Devon's cavalry, which is in the adjacent hex. And then, of course, we will have some reaction capability there. But that is an assault action. We will talk in depth about that. So there are a couple of different ways to march. You can march individual units, which is not very efficient, but sometimes a necessity because they are spread out. You can activate a leader to activate multiple units to march, which is a little more efficient, and lets you set up specific flanking attempts for attacks. And then you can activate a series of units for an assault. Now, you'll notice I did not say anything. I mentioned assaulting for the way to attack. The other way you can initiate combat is during a march action. So we will look at the difference between attacking while a unit is marching along and encountering an enemy in an adjacent hex versus when they're already in place and they're making that 7 a.m. bugle call attempt to assault the breastworks in the next hex. So we're going to see the 2 variations on that. The other 2 activation types that they can do, that a unit can do, is they can burn railroad stations. So we can see over here on the map, some of these maps will have, I'm going to hide here, like for example Hanover and Cell Station, anything that's on a railroad that actually has these little red buildings. Those are railroad stations, and depending on the scenario or the campaign game, for logistics and supply, you are attempting to burn down some of these. You can either damage them a little bit and they have the capability of being rebuilt, or you can destroy them utterly by burning them to the ground, depending on the size of the unit that's doing that. I'm not going to go into a lot of how that works today, but essentially that is an action. The unit is there and you basically say light the torches and throw them in, and they're using that particular initiative action for burning down a railroad station. The last one that we're also kind of give short shrift today is entrenchments. And this is only in 1864 scenarios, and potentially 1865 when we get into things like Petersburg, when that comes down the pike. Or optionally, if both players agree upon it, some of the scenarios that are set in 1863, that is an optional rule. You can have entrenchment as part of the action cycle. Now, normally in the 1861, 62, and 63, as they are printed, entrenchment occurs at the end during the recovery. So you do all your actions, and then you go into the recovery cycle. That's when entrenchment occurs. Essentially, a unit that is sitting and has done nothing for the entire day. So, for example, Hood is sitting in Gettysburg. He has done no fatigue. They're perfectly rested during the recovery cycle. Then that unit could add, and the automation, as I mentioned, will add entrenchments to them. So again, depending on which scenario or which module you're in. Earlier in the war, it was a little slower as they were digging in. When you get into 1864, they have faster capability of entrenching. Plus, you have the capability of doing that as an action. So as you activate a unit, a leader activates 2 units. One of them, he says, I'm going to march down the road. The other one, he says, dig in, and then they can actually add a level of entrenchment to their position. You can see here on Vassal, in this case, normally you'd be putting little markers on the table that say building breastworks, breastworks complete. They can go fort level, so this adds to the level of modifier. Basically, breastworks come in a couple of flavors here. So when you see on Vassal here that in this all-in-one tool that it's at B2, that means the breastworks have been completed, and it is a 2 times modifier. So from a defensive standpoint, all the numbers there on the bottom, with the exception of tactical, the 2 black numbers, are doubled. So that 12 becomes defending as if it were 24 manpower there. And it has 8 artillery batteries because of the defensive capabilities afforded by those breastworks. And they can also continue up to Control U, so you can see F means a fort is starting. Right now it's still got a 2 times multiplier, and then it's got a 3 times multiplier there. So once the fort is complete, that is literally Fortress Gettysburg, and that is a 36 manpower. Hood's division is 36 manpower in defense. So again, 1864 is primarily when you are doing entrenchments as part of an action. Otherwise, it will just occur naturally as part of the recovery cycle. And as Paul Harvey would say, now page 2. I'm on page 2 of my notes here. So, are there any questions before I move on to movement? Have I lost anybody? Wade, go for it.
Quick question on the all the units have like the Confederates have a red box around their combat value, I guess,
Yes.
or the
yes,
and that's to indicate that they're all in the same army.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
Most of the time, as you can see, for the Union, because they have so many different corps, like Hancock down here has a little red banner behind him. That way, you can look easily and see which units with their NATO symbol have the color red in them. So, like Gibbon, Hayes, and Caldwell, their little infantry symbol has a little red background, so you can see, oh, they're all part of the 2nd Corps. And it's the same with the Confederates up here. So Longstreet has an orange. That means all the ones that have orange in the background of their unit symbol belong to Longstreet. That's just a visual mnemonic for folks. You can also look and see that, oh, there's a little 1 there, the Roman numeral 1. So McLaws and Hood are part of the 1st Corps. The background number for the tactical capability is, I think, more just to stand out. It doesn't have any particular intrinsic. It's just so you can differentiate that as a command number versus the manpower in this case, or the artillery values. Great question.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay, well then let's talk about movement. Movement is how you get things from here to there. As they say in Maine, you can't get there from here. But that's what you want to do in this game. most of the time, I want to get Hill and Heath from up there beyond the Lutheran Church, and I want to get them tangling in to meet Buford down here. So I'm going to open up on the video here. I'm opening up the movement chart. And all things being equal, and this is also somewhat scenario dependent, meaning that, or not scenario, but rather module dependent. So early in the war, like all green alike, which is part of Stonewall Jackson's Way 2, units are going to be a little slower. And Roger and I right now are going through on to Richmond. Some of those units also are a little slower. And so they make modifications based on overall sort of terrain effects and command ability as to how some of these units move. But for this example today with roads to Gettysburg, on the movement chart, you can see that most of the time when a Confederate or when a Union unit by itself moves and marches, it just rolls a d6 and it gets what it gets, and it moves along the road network or the terrain, and you deduct the movement points based on that number. Now, it should be said here that a unit always has the capability to move adjacent. It can move 1 hex. It can make a minimum 1 hex move. Sometimes that's advantageous. So let's say I want to put this artillery reserve down here. Let's say the road to Round Top did not exist. So I'm going to give this example here. Let's say they're at 3104 and I want to put them on Round Top, but I roll a 1. Well, okay, that's terrible, but that's normal. So I can always do a minimum 1 hex move and just put that there. Now the exception of which is I can't do that across a mountain hexside or a swamp. We don't have any swamps here up in southern Virginia, or excuse me, southern Pennsylvania. So that is not a factor here. You can also do that across creeks here, provided that you're not in a rain turn. Rain is always a factor that occurs in some of these modules as part of a random event. If it were raining, this creek would be treated like a minor river, so you couldn't just cross over it that way. So there are always exceptions to the 1 hex minimum move, but all things being equal, if I wanted to just put this here and I didn't have enough movement, I can always move it 1 hex and get it to a new location. But so Union units, divisions, subordinate units, the actual infantry units will just roll a d6. The Pender, for example, the Confederate units will roll a d6 and get a +1 because of their, again, inherent knowledge of the local terrain or local sympathizers showing them ways around, obstacles, things like that. So I would come up here and I would just roll a d6 for Pender, and he rolls a 5. So I add 1 to that and he gets a 6. So then I literally I give him a fatigue. So he is now at fatigue level 1. And he starts to march. So I just say, I want to take him to Newman's Pass. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When folks see this on a table at a gaming convention and they walk up and they say, oh, is this like Monopoly? You can actually say, yes, I'm rolling the dice and I'm moving my units. It's just like Monopoly. So that is how movement works in a nutshell for that. Leaders, if a leader activates, let's say Longstreet is with McLaws here, and I'm doing a leader activation, and I want to move both Longstreet and Hood at the same time. Now he is activating both of them. So Hood would get a fatigue, and let's say McLaws would be going to fatigue level 2 there. I then roll a die, and per the chart up here for infantry leaders, we would add a +2 unless you're in one of these specific titles. So Longstreet would add a +2 to whatever the die roll is. However, and this is where it's important to understand, that number applies to both units. So if you roll poorly, that's the risk you take because it's now assigned to all the units that are activated to march. So Longstreet activates to march. Here's what he rolls. He rolls a 6. Hey, all right. This will never happen in real life for me. Trust me. So now we add his 2 bonus to that. Both Hood and McLaws would get to move 8 movement points. So they can really get some moving. So you can go 1, 2, let's say I wanted to go off-road and I wanted to cross over White Run here into 3602. That's when I look at my terrain effects chart for major terrain, major terrain. And we can see the movement point cost is listed on the chart there. So clear is listed as 3. So I've gone 1, 2, and I have 6 left over. I could expend 3 to cross over that and then continue down the road if I wanted to. So I've gone 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and I've gotten it down to the brickyard. Now, one of the tricks of great campaigns is being able to assess the road network and plan, saying, okay, I really need to get this unit over here. What is the most efficient way? But there are always going to be obstacles like terrain and enemy units. Now, when a unit is moving, and I'm going to bring in, let's see, Slocum seems like a Slocum, and we'll just bring all of Slocum stack here. And we're going to say Slocum was here, and Longstreet's coming by. Whenever a unit is moving and it enters any one of the hexes surrounding an enemy unit, now this is where we talk about zone of control. A zone of control is exerted by any unit into all of the surrounding hexes, with one exception, which we'll talk about. There's always an exception. In this case, Slocum exerts a zone of control into 3604, into the store there. So when Longstreet and McLaws arrive at that, they have two options. They can either stop the march and end the action, and then they will go to the next initiative, or they can attack on the march. They can initiate combat during a marching action. That requires an outlay of some movement points. And depending on how many movement points you have left, that could either be very helpful or very, so you could, it literally runs a chart from, if I'm looking at the combat modifiers here, we have an attack summary. And when you are expending points, you can spend 0 points to do a column of route, which means that they were literally marching down the road, and they pull their rifles and they shoot off to the side with no preparation whatsoever. And you can see that it costs nothing, but it's a -3, and we'll talk about all the modifiers during combat, but it will severely impact negatively your combat capability. You can also do a hasty one, which only requires for infantry you spend 1 movement point. You could do a -1 modifier. But ideally, what you're attempting to do is get to a point where you have 2 movement points left over and do a normal attack on the march, in which case it would have no effect whatsoever, neither good nor bad, on your die roll modifiers. But the best way of doing that, if let's say in this case up here, I'm going to move my chart a little out of the way. Let's say that Longstreet was here, Slocum was right here, and we still had rolled that 6, and we got 8 total because of Longstreet. Then McLaws could move right here. He expends 1. He has 7 movement points left over, which means that he could spend 4 of those final movement points to do a prepared attack on Slocum and everyone in that hex. You attack everyone in the hex as a unit. That would give him a +1 modifier to his die roll, and that would make things a little more likely. So they didn't have to move very far. They were ready for battle. Mechanically, or in the narrative in your mind, you could see that they didn't have to move very far to engage in battle, and they were ready for combat. So that is known as a prepared attack on the march. So those are all the ways that you can move. Again, once Longstreet and McLaws entered that hex, they have to immediately make that decision. If he chooses not to battle, then he just says, we'll just stop there. If I had other units that were still moving, then they could then perform their subsequent move. So Hood could then move, and he would get to the zone of control of the artillery reserve. He would also have to make that determination. He would either attack or just stop. So it is not compulsory. You do not have to attack. You can use your movements to simply get units into position for subsequent assaults or attacks. The one thing I did not mention, and I will talk about that now, well, actually I did mention up here, we talked about leader transfers at the beginning of the turn, which case all of one side, all the Union does theirs formally within 10 hexes, and then the Confederate does theirs. But whenever a leader activates multiple units, he also has the capability of transferring at that moment. So in this same situation, Longstreet activated both McLaws and Hood, but he decides it is more advantageous for him to march along with Hood. He can then immediately transfer to that subordinate unit. So it has to be a subordinate unit that was just activated, and it has to be within 3 hexes of the activating leader. It can also not be unless it's immediately adjacent. So talk about another example here. I'm throwing a lot of examples at you, but I think that from a practical standpoint, they give you an idea of how it works. In this situation here, Longstreet could not activate Hood because of that concept of zone of control. So the zone of control will interrupt the command capability of units because it's exerted into Gettysburg here. The only way you could get around that is if you had a friendly unit there to build a sort of chain around it, because that makes sense. You could actually still send the couriers through the lines to get to the unit. So Longstreet could activate Hood because he has a connection through Pender, even though Slocum has a zone of control into Gettysburg proper. But in this situation here, Longstreet wants to activate Hood, but he can't. Hood is kind of orphaned on his own. He has to be activated by himself. So he cannot get the capability of Longstreet. However, if Hood was right there, going back to the original point, I decide I want to activate them both. I can then transfer Longstreet over to Hood, and then he will march along with. So that is how leader activations work. They have to be within 3 hexes. They have to either be adjacent or connected adjacent to get around the issues with zone of control. And they can immediately transfer to them, but it has to be done before the first march occurs. So you couldn't, try this shenanigans where you move McLaws along, yada yada yada, and then say, oh, now I want to move Longstreet over to Hood. No, you can't do that. You actually have to do it before you exert the first movement. So that is the difference between single unit marching and leader activation. Leader activation, again, is a much wider command and control capability, but like with all dice rolls, you're taking a risk that you roll a 1 and every unit that's activated gets that same movement point allocation. So it could be good, could be bad. You have to make the call of when it's appropriate to do that. Questions? Anybody have a question before I continue on?
Hey Patrick.
Yes, sir.
When you had Pender up in the mountains there, it raised a question for me.
Yes, sir.
With the trails. And what I have found in playing is that it's hard for me to tell where is a trail and where is a road. And obviously there's a different movement point allowance for each.
There is.
And we ended up, my partner and I, using the squiggly rule line. If it's squiggly, it must be a trail. But we had initially said, well, any road going through a mountain hex must be a trail, but that's not obviously that's obviously not true.
That is not true.
So,
right.
So can you help? Can you help me figure it out?
You can. I actually see this one come up online a lot. When you look at the terrain effects, let's see. When I pull up the roads and rails, oh wow, they do have it there. So you can see a road if you're looking at that. So it says TEC roads and rails. We have a road is a solid line, and we don't have any examples here that I was just looking through all the mountains, but I don't see them. I think in some of the Virginia maps, and definitely over on Battle Above the Clouds, we have that a lot. Trails are dashed lines, so you'll see it will be a dashed line through the mountains. So it is squiggly to be sure, but it actually is it's a dashed line rather than a solid.
Yeah, and if you look real close, it sort of looks dashed.
Right.
But it's been hard for me to tell.
Yeah, I don't see any on this map, but it is really apparent, especially on the Battle Above the Clouds maps and on I believe Atlanta's are. So you can really see they stand out a bit. The other question we get is the hex side terrain related to trails, and that is a ridge. Again, we don't have any on this map, but over on the western ones in northern Georgia, you have sort of a flat top. I'm thinking about Sand Hill or Sand Mountain, whatever it is. It's sort of a flat top, and it's got mountains on a side, but then the top of the terrain is kind of a flat or rolling or clear or whatever. The edge of that is called a ridge, and you can see that is on the hex side terrain one. People are like, what is a ridge? I don't see that. There are none on this map, but basically it's where the trail comes up over into the flat part of the mountain, and then it will basically to just go over that lip either above or coming down off of it just exerts a +1 to the movement. So if you're going by road, it just becomes a 2 to get over the lip rather than a 1. But that's a great question. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Sure. Yes, trails get everybody because they're not immediately apparent on all maps because they don't have them. In this case here, with the Catoctin Mountains and South Mountain, most of the roads traveling through the mountains had been there for probably centuries at this point, and they're pretty well cut through into these gaps. Okay, so we've talked about movement. Let's talk about
Patrick.
Oh no, Roger's got a question. I don't know.
Sorry. If you go to Gettysburg or you're center on Gettysburg, if you have Lee on with claws and you activate both of those divisions with Longstreet,
correct,
can you transfer Lee to Longstreet?
So in most cases, and Lee can certainly be on McClaw's, since Lee cannot quote activate a leader, he is along for the ride. So the only way to get Lee off of McClaw's in this case would be for Longstreet to transfer over to McClaw's, and then subsequently they could both go back to Hood. Yeah, okay. Yeah, because they never do the activating themselves. They're attached to. And as we saw in some of them, they like a corps commander can never be attached to cavalry or an artillery unit. It always has to be an infantry unit, but it certainly does not preclude Longstreet from saying, hey, I got to go over here to Hood's division and take care of some business, and leaving Lee with McClaw's. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. He just can't move on his own. He has to get carried along. Also, they can never drop off. So in this situation here, if Longstreet's moving along with Hood, he couldn't just say, okay, now Longstreet's going to stop here and I'm going to take Hood and keep going. He has to go to that location and just stop, and then subsequently the activation and leader transfer goes from that. Great question. All right, the real reason you guys are all here is how do you shoot something, right? So let's talk about combat. There are 2 variations of combat that we mentioned. The first one is the attack on the march, which has its own. The technique is essentially the same. It's just one or 2 minor steps ahead of that. There is a procedure that you go through, depending on whether you're attacking while you're marching or you're actually doing a full frontal assault on a fixed hex. So we'll talk about each of them in turn. We'll start with attacking on the march, as we did. The way it works is, and this is where if you have a piece of scratch paper, and this is what Roger and I like to do when we're playing, is you go through all of the individual die roll modifiers, and this is kind of bedeviling to new players, and it gets a lot, trust me, it gets easier with subsequent play. But when you're going through the combat, you are basically doing an accounting sheet of all the different die roll modifiers, and some of them become second nature just by you looking at the map as you get more experience with this. But for new players, there's a lot that seems like it's going on. But essentially it breaks down into 3 basic ones, basic modifiers, and then there's things that you add on after the fact that you're attempting to make more advantageous for your particular side. So the combat works like this. It is an offsetting die roll. So Roger and I are attacking each other. I am Longstreet. I've arrived with Hood at this location, and Hood is the one making the attack on the march. I have 5 movement points left over, and I am going to make a prepared attack. So I indicate that. I am certainly not obligated to. I can use any of the lesser ones that I wish. The reason that might be important or helpful is because if I don't expend those on the attacking, and I manage to have this very successful attack where basically I defeat him so well that nothing occurred to my attacking army, then I have movement points left over. I can continue marching. This might be helpful if you vastly overwhelm them in size differential. So, a 12 manpower army is attacking a 1 manpower cavalry or something. The cavalry says, we're going to stand and fight. Well, the odds now are overwhelmingly in favor of the attacking army, so they are less likely to be scratched by those men on horses. So they could afford to spend a lesser amount of points, either for a hasty attack or a normal attack, and bank some of those leftover movement points that they could use after the fact, presuming that they don't get, repulsed in some way. It happens. Trust me, it happens. But for the most part, you're going to try to get all the modifiers that you can sort of on your side of the equation. I liken it to an algebraic equation, and I immediately have scared off half the players right now. But it really isn't too bad. It's just, debits and credits. You want to get all of the credits on your side to offset any debits that you're going to get by the dice roll. So essentially you add up all the modifiers that you're going to get, and you arrive at, say I've got a +3. So whatever my die roll is, I'm going to get +3 to it. And Roger makes his die roll as the defender, and we just compare the 2 numbers. That's all it is. It's just an opposed die roll. So I roll a 6, and he rolls 1. I add the 3 to that, so I've got 6 plus 3 is 9, and I subtract whatever he rolled. So he rolled a 1, and then I get a final number of 8, and I will then open up the combat chart, and I will look at the particular combat results column, depending on what my attacker's combat value is. Now, the combat value is simply the manpower, and the one thing we haven't talked about yet is when units become disorganized. So I'm going to, for example, I'm going to show you 2 examples here where Hood is attacking while he's fresh. He's got a manpower value of 12. That is also his combat value. However, let's say yesterday he made a failed attack and he got disorganized. So what happens is when I flip that, if I were actually flipping this over on the table, the manpower number you would see 2 numbers there. The number in red, 8, is his combat value now effectively, which is about 66% of its normal capability for his manpower. And then the small number there shows the 12. And that 12 just indicates that's how many men are there, but their fighting capability is reduced down to an 8. So that number is the combat value, depending on your attack. Those are the numbers that you're trying to build your ratio against. But at the same time, that's also going to affect the final outcome here when you look at which column the attacker is depending on. So if he was reduced and attacked, his combat value was 8 in this situation. So I look at my attacker's combat value, and I'm on the 7 to 11 column. And with that +8 that I rolled, I see I've got a small a, which just means nothing happened to me. I can advance after the fact. That's the ideal. That's what you want. Any of these other numbers here, so if I'm looking at the E, just means that nothing happened, I can advance into the hex, but it ends that particular action.
For some reason, I'm not seeing the combat results table here.
Oh, okay. If you're looking at it on Vassal, you have to open it yourself. If you're looking at it, you mean on the shared screen?
On the shared screen.
Oh, that's what? Because it's a separate window. That's why. Yeah, sorry about that. But you'll see it on the video after fact. Sorry. Yeah, so if you want to open up your local combat chart there and just follow along, I'm on column 8. So you can see that when we're looking at down here in the modifiers, the key at the bottom indicates all of the different capability or all of the different outcome, essentially from A, which just means advance after combat, to E, which is end action. Small f, you advance that unit's fatigue by 1. Big F, you advance by 2, and then you get into the worst situation, which is the D's and the R's. Capital D means that at the end of the action, that unit will become disorganized. So if it's on its fresh side, it will flip over and become disorganized. So he's lesser effective in the future. So in that situation there, if Hood was still on his 12 side, after the combat, he would flip over to the disorganized side. And then we can see the small r, which on this chart is still misprinted, but a small r is a retreat. We're going to talk about how the retreats work in a little bit. That means it's a minimum retreat. They just have to basically vacate the hex. And then the capital R there is a rout. You defeated them so soundly that they broke and fled. They exit the hex, and they have to run far, far away. Now, it should be said that most of these hexes, this scale represent about a mile, 1.15, I think, miles across. So when you're pushing them out of a hex, you're pushing them at minimum, 2 miles away, up to anywhere from 6 or 7 miles, based on whether it's a small retreat or a rout. Okay, so circling all the way back around to on the combat chart, when you're setting up your attack, you look at 3 basic modifiers. The first one is the type of attack, which we talked about. So depending on how many movement points on a march you're expending, it's either a hasty, a normal, or a prepared, or God help you, a column of rout. Then you will look at the tactical capabilities between the 2 units. So in this case, Longstreet is marching along with Hood, and he is encountering Slocum's stack here. And for the defender, you look at the highest, so we can see there's 2 subordinate units and Slocum is in there. You look at the highest tactical value of the entire hex. So in this case, he would be attacking against Slocum's tactical capability. So Longstreet, he's attached to McLaws, he's a 4 versus Slocum, so the net difference there is a +1 in favor. So if you're sitting there with scratch paper, and this is what I advise new players to do, is just sit there and work through all of it like as if it was a little worksheet. That way you have your numbers. Roger and I do this many times during a game, and we sit there and we calculate it on the fly, and it becomes second nature, like I said. So you would start with the type of attack, and then you indicate what the tactical difference is. That can be anywhere from a wash of 0, it doesn't have any factor. If they're both 3, then it's a 0, so there is no effect on combat. When a Union unit is attacking some of these higher tactical capability, like Hill and Longstreet, there will be potentially a negative. So if Slocum was in reverse attacking Longstreet, his tactical modifier would be a -1 because he is a lesser general in the eyes of the game here. So you have the type, and then the tactical, and then you look at ratio. Ratio is just determined at the moment of the attack by looking at the total value of the combat value, not the manpower, but the combat value, which if they're organized is 1 and the same, but if they're disorganized here, as in Hood's case, is an 8. You would look at that and say, okay, 8 is attacking a total value of 15. And that's where we go back into our old Avalon Hill brain, and we say, okay, 8 into 15 is not quite 1 to 2, but because it's somewhere between 1 to 1 and 1 to 2, it is basically considered round in favor of the defender. So since he doesn't have, anywhere from 8 to or 9 to 16 is going to be considered a 1 to 2. If you had 17, then you go into the 1 to 3 because it goes up to the next. It rounds all the way up to the next value. So on the combat table, then the combat modifiers, you would look at the ratio, and the ratio chart is printed there. If you switch over from the combat chart tab to the modifiers tab, the ratio chart indicates you look at the attacker to defender. Now obviously you're trying to get 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, because for those factors you are getting pluses on your side of the attack. If you're a smaller unit attacking a larger, you can figure you're going to get negative. So sure enough, in a attacker to defender is 1 to 2, it's going to be a -1. So I've marked that down. Okay, my ratio is -1. Not great, but sometimes necessary. Then the last thing you would look at, or not the last, but one of the one you always look at is artillery. Is you look at the artillery comparison. So between the defender, he has 3 pieces of artillery there. Hood is the single attacker. He's got 4 pieces. So that is a difference now. Now, for those of you who ever played the original individual titles, this is different now with the standard series rules. They've kind of streamlined the way artillery works, and to me, this is the way I learned, so it's much easier for me. So for some folks that are used to playing the original titles before they were streamlined, you will have to unlearn how artillery works in favor of this calculation, which is really not too bad. You basically just look at the net differential between the artillery pieces of attacker and defender, and then you just consult the artillery modifier chart, another chart, right? And you cross-reference basically the differential with the type of terrain that the defending unit is in. It's always based on what you're attacking into. So Slocum is activating is occupying Culp's Hill, which is considered rough terrain, and he has 3 and I have 4, so it's a +1 in my favor, right? So I look on the column of -3 to +1 differential, and I come down to the rough, and I see that it says -1 with a star. Anytime there's any kind of notation there, that usually means there's some action that has to happen. In this case, I would roll a die, so we leave it to the vagaries of chance, right? I will roll a die, and if it's an even, that's not what I want as the attacker. That even number means that I would use whatever's printed there. So if I roll a 2, 4, or 6 on a die, then a -1 is applied as a artillery modifier. If it's an odd number, 1, 3, or 5, then we just ignore artillery completely because the rough terrain precludes setting up of the batteries, and that's something to be looked at. And then, as we're continuing on, the one other factor we have here in this case is terrain, and I am attacking across a creek here. So anytime you attack across a creek, it's a -1, and we can see that that's on the terrain effects chart, I believe here. For Hexide, it's creek. If you look at the notes on it, it says if you're attacking across it in a rain turn, you can't because it's treated like a full river. But normally when you're attacking across a creek, that is a die roll modifier of -1, and that's on the you can see here the defender's die roll. They call it a +1. Now this is where for new players you're like, wait, but that says I don't understand. This is just a style of play. This is the way I do it. Is I take all the modifiers and I apply them to the attacker. I think it's fun. I find it easier, especially when I'm playing solo, is to just put everything on the same side of the equation, all the pluses and minuses based on the attacker's number and die roll. That way, you're not both sitting there going, okay, well, you've got a +2 and I've got a +2. Well, what's the difference? It's 0, so it's just whatever the die roll is, right? So if there are offsetting pluses and minuses, you just bring them all together and you figure out what is a final attacker-based modifier. I find that a lot easier. I think Roger, that's the way I taught him. I hope he agrees. If not, then that, you can certainly do it your own way. But on the defender, you'll note on the defender chart, it adds defender modifiers too. And the easiest thing is to just kind of bring them all together on one side in relationship to the attacker's final modifier. Again, you don't have to do it that way. I just find it easier for mathematics and for arithmetic when you're doing these calculations on the fly to just have everything consistent in that context. So we arrive at that. The other modifiers, which I did not talk about, are flanking. Flanking can add considerable, anywhere from a +1 to a +4 to the attack. Ideally, what you're trying to do is get around your units, your defender's flanks, try to turn him. That makes your attack more potent, more deadly. Those are additional values that you can add to this. We will literally attack that separately. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So yes, attacking here, we got all the modifiers, and then you just roll the dice. So you have here in Vassal, you have a double die roller, so you have a 2d6 roller. And what we do is, the convention is the attacker just rolls the dice for both people, and whatever the first number is, the Union is on the left. Again, that's just a convention of choice. Union is the first number, Confederate is the second. That way, if everybody played that way, then we'd have a consistent sort of gaming convention. So I will roll the dice. Let's say McClaws is a final net modifier of a +2. I roll the die. He is on the right-hand side, so in this case, he would be a final of a 5 versus the Union 6, which is a -1 based on the attacker. And then I would come up and just look at what happens for a -1 based on his attacking level of 8. He would lose, so the number there indicates how many manpower he loses, which is usually a premium for victory points in most of these scenarios, if not all scenarios. You calculate how many manpower losses are accrued by both sides. So the Confederate player would lose 1 manpower here. He would then flip that unit over to disorganized if it was not already. And with a disorganized, you also accumulate 3 levels of fatigue. So if he was at fatigue level 1, he would get 3 more. That would take him all the way to fatigue level 4, which means ostensibly he is done for the day. That's what we like to call it. He's done for the day. He made an attack, he was repulsed, and he's just going to sit there for the rest of the day and do nothing, and then at the end of the day, he will recover. And that's how that works. So that is an attack based on a march. I will shift gears here and talk about an assault, which is just based on attacking from a fixed location to an adjacent hex. This requires a leader, a core leader, to be in that particular hex. So in this same example of Longstreet versus Slocum battling for Culp's Hill, that's exactly what's going on here. Longstreet wins the activation. The Confederate player indicates that he is going to launch an assault on Slocum's position. And combat works exactly the same, with only one additional little wrinkle, and that is the fortunes of command and control. You have to make an attempt, and that attempt may or may not work. You never know. That's why we love this game. So Longstreet, the first thing he does, he indicates which in the stack is going to make the attempt, and he has the ability to activate as many in the stack that he wishes, but they all have to be in that same location, that same hex. So he indicates that both Hood and McClaws are going to make an attempt. So the first thing he does is he advances their fatigue level each by 1, so they commit to spending a fatigue whether it goes off or not. And then the very first thing he does is he has to write down some notes to the courier and send them out to the individual division commanders and try to launch the attack. And this is where it may or may not be successful at all, or with varying degrees of success. So he will come up here and he will roll a die, and he will compare that number to his command, which, if you remember, the command is the not small, but the black number. It's not in color. So his command level is 7, which is great. He has a very strong command capability. So you'll roll the command number, and the only thing that you don't want right off the top is a 6. So I'm going to roll a command for him, and I roll a 1, which is great. So I take that number that I rolled on the die, and I subtract it from his command of 7. And that leaves me with 6. So potentially, if I had 6 units all in that hex, 6 divisions, and I committed all of them to the assault, Longstreet would overwhelmingly have the support of all the division commanders to go for that assault. He could activate and they would all commit to the battle. If I had rolled the other end of the spectrum, if I had rolled a 6 is an automatic failure. The courier's horse got shot, or he stopped off at the tavern, or whatever. The orders did not get to the commanders at all, and that's it. That's the end of that action. It just fails, and you go to the next initiative. So that's no fun, but that happens more often than you would know. Personal experience. All right, so I'm going to bring another example in here. So let's say in this case here, he manages to get the command to go. The next option he has, provided that Lee, or the army commander for either side, so if Lee is in this situation here, as long as he is within 3 hexes and not cut off by a zone of control, he's in the same hex, so he certainly can do this. Longstreet could then request what's known as a grand assault. This is where the game gets really, really fun. This allows you the capability of bringing in additional units that are surrounding or adjacent to the defender, but were not necessarily activated in the initial assault attempt. So there's a couple ways that you can understand that. One is to bring in other units from around. So in this case, I could potentially bring Pender into the attack from Slocum's flank. The other possibility is if I had decided not to activate McClaws, and I had only activated Hood, and the assault went off, I could then potentially bring in any additional units from that same starting hex that were not initially activated. So it's a gamble, but it's a potential that you could add additional units to the combat. This has the added benefit of increasing your manpower ratio. So if manpower was deficient compared to the defender, you can certainly bring in additional units to attack and to offset that ratio deficiency. The other factor is it brings in all of their artillery pieces as well. So now the way we do this is after you've made the assault attempt, the assault goes off. Now Longstreet says, General Lee, do I have permission to make a grand assault? And you roll another die. And again, if you roll a 6, it just fails. And whatever started the attack goes off and does their own thing as their usual. However, I'm going to roll a die here and see what we get. It is a 6. So Lee said, no, that would not be prudent. So Longstreet is denied the ability to do a grand assault. I'm going to roll again just to see what happens. It's a 2. So in this situation, since it wasn't a 6 on that second roll, and I'm only doing this for example purposes, you only get one shot at the grand assault, just in case you're taking notes out there. So in this second example, I rolled a 2, which is potentially successful. I take that 2 number and I subtract it from Lee's overall army command, which is 5. That number, the resulting number, is 3. And that tells me that's the number of additional hexes, and this is very important to understand, it's additional hexes, so total value of all the units in these additional hexes that I could contribute to the grand assault. So I'm gonna just make this even more elaborate example here. So now I have Pender and Heath adjacent to Slocum. With this successful grand assault, I could bring in these additional hexes with Pender and Heath into the combat. And then I would add all of their additional manpower and all of their additional artillery batteries into the calculation for ratio and artillery. Now, the prudent, the non-cavalier side, this is Patrick taking off his gamer hat, saying that yes, that's a good thing. This is where I warn new players about this. Certainly you could do this. This will help get you out of a deficiency for manpower or artillery, but it does come at a cost. When you start to look at, and I encourage new players to study the combat results chart, when you look at these columns that are very high, like 38 to 49, let's say I brought in all those units and now I have a 38 manpower attack, even at, let's say I get a 2, I get a +2 as my final. I drove them out of there, but look what happened. I got 3 DA. So I took 3 manpower losses just in the attack because of all of those extra bodies into the attack. So that is kind of the gaming part of this, where you try to figure out what is the capability of doing the most damage with the least friendly fire or the least disorganization and casualties from the attacker's side. So more does not always mean better. If I can give you no other advice from an experienced player, more units are not always better. But that is up for you to decide in the moment. All right, so I'm going to pause here for questions on combat. I'm sure we've got some. Hearing none. All right, you guys are all attacking wizards now. Okay, so I think probably what we got 30 minutes left here, and then Clyde's going to take over with the Battle of Gettysburg. The last thing I want to talk about, just very briefly, is the concept of flanking. Since I've got Hill and Pender here now in this setup, I want to add just that wrinkle of how flanks work in combat, how they can improve the attacker's modifier by setting up these flanks. Flanking as a concept is very easy. Well, I say this with many years of experience. It's easy for me. I don't know why people don't understand it, but it is kind of daunting for new players, because the concept of zone of control can be modified by a variety of things. So mountains and swamps and woods will affect this calculation. So I'm going to leave a lot of that to the more advanced session about flanking, but I just want to kind of broach the subject here just so you understand how it works. During an attack, in this situation here with Slocum, poor Slocum has been completely surrounded on Culp's Hill. It was not practicable for him to be up there, but that's where he is. And Lee and Longstreet are going to make an attack on Slocum, and in addition to the ratio and the type and the tactical and the artillery, once you've calculated all those things, now you can look at potential flanking modifiers. And there are a few different ones, so I'm going to show you a couple of different examples of it. The way flanking works is, first thing you do is you look at the presence of, if we're taking this in steps, the first step is to look at covered hexes. And that means you look at the zones of control or the presence of attacking units and how they are related to the defender. So in this case here, Longstreet exerts a zone of control into Gettysburg proper and to Wolf Hill, along with obviously the hex that he occupies. So those 3 hexes to the north of Slocum are considered covered for the purposes of step 1. Then Pender also exerts 2 zones of control, one into Wolf's Hill, which overlaps, so that is no net difference, but he also exerts one into 3303. So now if we look at between the 2 attacking, or between the presence of 2 offensive units, the attacker units, friendly units, there are 5 hexes covered. So from Gettysburg all the way clockwise around to 3303, there are 5 hexes that are covered. The only one that's not covered is Evergreen Cemetery. So we can see that there. So if you look at your chart for flanks, if we go over to combat modifiers, I think it's not there. It's on one of these charts. I apologize for not being able to find it directly, but basically, if you have 5 hexes, so 4 hexes covered, there is no flank modifier. If 5 hexes are covered, then the first modifier that you get with no subtractions is +2. So you're looking at a potential +2. You would then take out, in the second step, you would subtract out, I'm going to bring Reynolds up here as an example, you would uncover in step 2, you would take away from any modifier or any covered hexes, depending on whether they have impassable terrain, which is, again, a mountain or a swamp, or a woods hexide that's not connected to the attacker. And in this case, Reynolds is occupying one of the hexes that is covered by Pender's zone of control. So that +2, then in the second step, you would then take away any hex or any point that is uncovered by that. So in this case, that +2 then gets reduced down to a +1. So the final flank modifier is you take everything that's covered, those are your credits, and then you take away in step 2 anything that's uncovered, and that becomes the final flank modifier. So in this case, Longstreet would then get a +1 to his attack because he's got a flank of +1. Okay, so that's a pretty mild example. I'm going to bring Hill back up in here into 3303 and show you the most extreme example here. Same attack occurs from Longstreet's hex from the Brickyard into Slocum. Now all 6 hexes are covered because Evergreen Cemetery is now covered by Hill and Heath in their zone of control. So now all 6 hexes are covered, and no hexes are uncovered because there is no impassable terrain surrounding Slocum, and there's no friendlies that are uncovering all those zones and controls. So this would be the most extreme flank setup of +4. This is ideally what you're trying to set up with your attacks, is get a wonderful brutal flank. Not only is it going to give you +4 on this, but when you and I didn't talk about retreats and routes. Again, that's the kind of comes as you experience combat. In this case, setting up the flank. When Slocum has to retreat away from the attacker, he's going to take additional manpower losses because of his path off of Culp's Hill. So essentially, he would have to kind of go there, and then by doing so, because he's not connected by road, he's going to take some losses in manpower. Oops. we got feedback. I think, Cato, you've got your mic on if you want to mute that for me. Or Florin, I'm going to mute you. There you go. Okay. Awesome. So yeah, ideally you want to get a full 6 hexes of coverage around the defending unit to get that full flank. Going back to our uncovering example, let's say that Reynolds is up here on Evergreen Cemetery. He would then uncover one of the hexes of the surrounding 6, so that +4 would then be reduced by 1 to a +3 final flank. And that...
Patrick.
Yeah.
Patrick,
yes, sir.
Can I just interrupt here? Can we have Florin mute your mic?
He did. He took care of it.
I thought you did on your end. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I'm still getting... Now it's good.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay.
So
yes, so when you're setting up flanks, you wanna look at how you position your units around. This is part that comes with the experience of play, is kind of sweeping in there very quickly with a multi-unit march, setting up a flank, hopefully getting the next initiative, and then making the successful flanking attack. Again, that all comes with experience of play. It's not always going to be successful. So don't be discouraged if you set up this beautiful attack and it fails. That happened to me a lot when I was first playing, and I threw my hands up and I said, I don't understand this. The attacker always gets the worst end of it. Yes, but there are ways to mitigate that by good setup. The last thing I really want to just talk about before I wrap up today and turn it over to questions, I have given you enough information to understand the units, how leaders work, how units are activated, how you can march, and how you can attack both on the march and with an assault. I will leave the flanking and some of the retreating to later seminars and to the moment that you actually experience those, because every situation is different. The last thing I want to talk about is we talk about zone of control. I want to talk about restricted zone of control. I'm going to bring an example over here that, let's say Reynolds is in 2505 here. He's occupying this woods hex here, and Hill and Heath are coming down off the mountain. A woods hexide activates, or a woods hex is exactly like any other hex as far as zone of control, with one small exception called the restricted zone of control. That is for the purposes of units moving next to it. So let's say Hill's got 6 movement points. He comes down off the mountains. 1, 2, 3. So in this situation right here, Reynolds, because he's in the woods and there's no road connecting him with Hill and Heath's hex there at 2404, this is known as a restricted zone of control, which means that Hill does not have to stop at all. He is not engaged into that zone of control. If he moves either into here, 2405, or into Fairfield, 2504, now, because there is a road connected from Reynolds out of those woods into those hexes, now that is a normal zone of control, and Hill is obligated to either stop or attack. So that is how it restricted. That throws a lot of new players. Just think of it mentally as they are normal for the purposes of for retreats and for flanking capability, but roads are important for determining whether the flank is reduced or whether the unit has to stop when it's moving adjacent to it. The other big factor is for the moving unit, for the active unit, for Heath here coming down off the mountain, when he hits 2404, that works the same way in reverse. He doesn't know Reynolds is in the woods there, so he cannot make an attack on the march because he just arrived at that woods hex side. He would actually have to be starting there on a subsequent initiative in order to make an attack into those woods. So it works kind of in double benefit. It precludes the unit from having to stop marching, but at the same time, the unit that's marching cannot make an attack at the moment that they arrive into that hex if they didn't start adjacent to a woods hex side. And it should be said that, and they even pointed out in the instructions, that just the presence of the wood, that is the major terrain feature. So whether or not it actually goes all the way to the edge of the hex, when we say hex side, it's still considered that whole hex is majority woods. So that is a woods hex side for the purposes of understanding a restricted zone of control. So I have gone on for about an hour 45. If you guys have any questions, I will be happy to spend the remainder of the time here answering those. I got as far as I wanted to go today with flanking. I will say, just as a personal plug there, that again, if you could take some time after the fact, if you want to learn more about these, go watch the videos on Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials. I will be recording all of these seminars today, so if you miss any of them, I will throw them up onto that channel as well, and we'll have links here in the announcements section. And you can learn more in depth about the Great Campaign system from the intro videos, but you can also see, as Roger and I have been playing through these individual scenarios, you can get an idea of how the different scenarios look and feel, and you can get a lot of good insight just watching the play styles and how things go, and how we grind our teeth when things go poorly, and it is really a lot of fun. So I really appreciate everyone being here today. I'll be happy to open it up for questions, like I said, and I'll be happy to give you any examples if you need.
Do we have any questions?
I take that as no. And there are no tomatoes that I can see coming at me, so I'm happy about
So
that.
Patrick,
Yes, sir.
fantastic job.
Thank you.
Putting this on. I was in and out. I was coordinating some other things. I don't think I could have spoken an hour and 45 minutes so eloquently as you have done so. There's a lot there.
Thank you.
I hope you've gotten, I'm sure everybody's gotten a lot out of the session. And I hope they will now take the opportunity to play some great campaigns. And in that regard, we have a couple options for you. First of all, Clyde, who is on with me right now, Clyde Longest, and I are just about, as soon as we get done here, we're going to start our intro multiplayer game. So you can just switch down to the next channel on Discord and then join us. We will be getting a room in the Roads to Gettysburg 2 module, which you're already in. So you can just, when we get that room together, you can just jump over there and be in the multiplayer game. We'll give you a command, help you along as much or as little as you want to be helped. If you're interested in additional learning opportunities, at noon today, we have an advanced cavalry tactics, which is going to be hosted by Dave Cross. And then later on today at 1600 or 4 o'clock Eastern time, Clyde, is it Clyde Bruno? Is Bruno going to be doing that with you, Clyde?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it's Clyde and Bruno. Justin Rice and Dave will do the cavalry tactics at noon. And then at 4 o'clock this afternoon, we'll do the flanking tactics with Bruno and Clyde. Okay. Any questions from anybody? Okay. Well, thank you very much once again, Patrick. We really appreciate this, and we'll see everybody around the convention.
Thank you, Ken. It was my pleasure. Have fun, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.